After speaking to the men on the night of April 19th and telling them that it was imperative that they remember the Alamo and remember Goliad as they prepared for battle, even though many still didn't believe they were going to fight. That night, Houston and about 750 to 900 men, depending on who you can believe when it comes to numbers, because sources vary and how they are added up, Houston and the Texian army crossed the wooden bridge over Vince's Bayou. And they were traveling light, and they marched until about midnight. They stopped for a brief rest, and then they continued on at dawn. Houston did not sleep that night. Before sunrise, he sent out 2 cavalry detachments to do some reconnaissance. One group went towards Nathaniel Lynch's ferry, the only practicable crossing to travel towards the Trinity and Sabine Rivers, and the other group rode towards New Washington, where Santa Anna had been in pursuit of the interim Texas government that was fleeing. And as they neared Lynch's ferry, the Texians captured a flatboat filled with supplies for the Mexican army, and Santa Anna had sent it on ahead from New Washington to be there to supply the army when he got there. But as it turns out, the hungry Texians benefited from it, and Houston and the rest of the army arrived about mid-morning. While the main body had been taking the ferry and started eating breakfast, the other detachment of mounted scouts that had been at New Washington had also been busy. While they were down at New Washington, they had witnessed Santa Anna's force readying to leave the town. There was a brief skirmish with a small troop of Mexican cavalry north of New Washington, and then they rushed to report to Houston. Santa Anna would be approaching the ferry on the road from Morgan's Point in New Washington. So when the scouts arrived with their news, the Texians were eating breakfast. And the news excited many of the men who were ready for conflict. Now, these men carried a vast array of weaponry. The regulars, few that they were the only ones armed in a somewhat consistent manner. Most of the regulars carried the Model 1816 Harper's Ferry smoothbore flintlock musket along with bayonets, which were a necessity in close combat after the single round had been fired. And the volunteers, they didn't have bayonets, but most carried a knife of some sort, including ones modeled after the famous one carried by Jim Bowie. These knives would have done the job of the bayonet in hand-to-hand combat. Their rifles were likewise varied, and some, especially the cavalry, would have had flintlock pistols and sabers. These men were also a varied lot. They came from all across the United States and places in Europe. To clear their weapons of moisture, several hundred men fired. This upset Houston. He chastised them, told them to be silent. Why alert the enemy of their location if they were close? He threatened to skewer the next man to fire his gun on his sword, but the irascible soldiers did not listen to his profane threats. Fortunately, the Mexican army did not hear the noise. They were too far away still. Eventually, in the distance, the Texians could see smoke in the direction of New Washington. While at Harrisburg, Santa Anna had sent Colonel Juan N. Almonte ahead, if you recall, with 50 dragoons to catch the fleeing Texas government. Santa Anna had followed with the rest of his force. Almonte narrowly missed capturing Burnett and much of his cabinet. President Burnett, along with his wife and the other officials, had just embarked in a rowboat. Almonte's men started firing at them, but seeing the presence of a woman on board, the colonel ordered them to cease fire. The Texas government eventually reached safety on Galveston Island, and Santa Anna arrived on April 19th to find that his desire to capture the so-called government of Texas had been thwarted again. The Texian army, after getting the news from the cavalry, then traveled back about 3/4 of a mile from the ferry on the Harrisburg Road. Houston ordered the men to set up camp along the bayou in a wooded area protected from view by a piece of rising ground. The camp was spread out for about 500 yards through the trees. The 2nd Regiment of Volunteers set up closest to the 200 to 300 yard wide bayou. Southwest of them camped Lieutenant Colonel Henry Millard's regiment of regulars. Southwest of them were the cavalry, and east of the cavalry was Colonel Edward Burleson's 1st Regiment of Volunteers. East of Millard's regulars is where J.C. Neal placed the 2 cannons, and they still had not yet been fired since their arrival. And there were not many tents. Most of the men had been sleeping and would sleep that night on the cold, damp ground near the 20 to 30 campfires that they had to set up. The only definitely known tent that was set up belonged to the commander, Sam Houston, and the bayou was at their rear. The San Jacinto was to their left, and on their front and right flank was the open prairie. Now, this land on which the Texian army found itself had been the land of the Iroquois, Ishak, the Atakosas, and the Karankawas possibly would have even come there also to hunt and live. But at this time, when they encamped in the live oak grove near Lynch's Ferry, the land belonged to a woman by the name of Peggy McCormick. Now, like about 100 of the Texian soldiers in the army at that time, 1/7 of the entire army, she was born in Ireland. The Irish had been early settlers of Texas, and at the Alamo, 12 of the defenders were Irish-born, and another 14 had Irish surnames. Mrs. McCormick, who was close to 50 years old, and her husband Arthur had both been born in Ireland in the late 1700s. In 1818, they immigrated to New Orleans, and then around 1823, Mr. and Mrs. McCormick, along with their 2 sons, John and Michael, had arrived in Stephen Austin's colony as part of the Old 300. They were deeded a league of land on the south side of Buffalo Bayou at its junction with the San Jacinto River on August 10th, 1824. Now, Arthur's stay in Texas was unfortunately not a long one. Arthur McCormick visited Stephen Austin at San Felipe in February and received approval to establish an iron colony. The dream came to nothing, though, because Arthur drowned in Buffalo Bayou on his return home. But Peggy McCormick and her 2 sons stayed on and persevered to build a life in Mexican Texas. They built a log cabin close to a small bay on the San Jacinto River known as Peggy's Lake, and they raised cattle on the prairie to drive and sell in Louisiana. When word of the disasters of the Alamo and Goliad had reached them, Mrs. McCormick joined the runaway scrape. Michael McCormick served as a courier for the government, and it would be this Irish woman's north cow pasture on which the decisive moment for the contest between the Texian and Mexican armies would play out. Alfonso Steele, who was originally from Kentucky and who lived to be the last survivor of the Texas army that fought at San Jacinto, left an interesting summary of the events of that day. He wrote, "We quit Santa Anna's trail when we crossed Vince's Bayou, we turning north, he east. About sunup, we were halted to get something to eat. About the time we got our fires kindled and some beef shot down, the scouts came dashing in and said the enemy were just over the ridge. We were immediately ordered to arms and to move on. We camped on Buffalo Bayou just above the junction of the San Jacinto River and the bayou. Some more beeves were driven up and killed, and we went to cooking and eating." He continued by saying, "There was a body of Mexicans in a little grove about 300 yards northeast of us who kept up a constant fire on us all the time we were cooking and eating, but they did no damage. 2 of our men slipped out through the grass to see if they could get close enough to shoot them. They discovered a little sailboat sailing up the bayou. They hid in the grass and waited until it got even with them. They then rose up and ordered them ashore. They saw it was manned by Mexicans, who jumped out on the opposite side and swam ashore and left the boat. One of the men gave his gun to his comrade and swam in and steered it right up to our camp. It was loaded with flour, meal, and salt. Houston placed a guard over it and sent the surgeons to see if it had been poisoned. They pronounced it all right, so it was issued out to us. This was the first bread we had had in some time. We had left our cooking utensils at Harrisburg, so we had nothing to cook bread on. We made it up in tin cups and roasted it in the ashes or rolled it on sticks and cooked it that way. We feasted that day, the 20th. And these Texian soldiers were happy to do so. They were indeed hungry and worn out on that cold gray morning. They were a ragged and worn-out bunch. One of a group of 9 recruits that arrived the next morning described them as, quote, unwashed and unshaven, their hair, beards, and mustaches untrimmed and matted, and their clothes were in tatters and plastered with mud. Their diet up to that point of getting those supplies had consisted mainly of boiled beef, so the flour for bread and coffee found in the Mexican supplies from the captured boat were great additions to the cattle they began to slaughter that morning. The cattle that the men slaughtered to ease their hunger belonged to the McCormicks. 22 years later, Thomas M. Hardiman, a veteran of the battle, would credit Mrs. McCormick's cattle with providing the foundation for the winning of independence and the establishment of the Republic of Texas's government. Houston recognized that the position that he was at had some issues. If things took a wrong turn, he needed to have a contingency plan, and as commander, he had to consider such things and the variety of barges, flatboats, and rafts that they had found floating in Buffalo Bayou could potentially be used as an escape route if the Napoleon of the West proved to be as great a commander as his ego announced. Delgado, who was with Santa Anna, provides this account of the Mexican army's actions leading up to the moments that the two armies finally met. He wrote, on the 19th, His Excellency ordered Captain Barragon to start with a detachment of dragoons to reconnoiter Houston's movements. We halted at that place, all being quiet. On the 20th, at about 8 o'clock a.m., everything was ready for the march. We had burnt a fine warehouse on the wharf and all the houses in the town when Captain Barragon rushed in at full speed, reporting that Houston was close on our rear and that his troops had captured some of our stragglers and had disarmed and dispatched them. There is in front of New Washington a dense wood through which runs a narrow lane about a half league in length, allowing passage to pack mules in single file only and to mounted men in double file. This lane was filled with our pickets, the drove of mules, and the remainder of the detachment. His Excellency and staff were still in the town. Upon hearing Barragon's report, he leapt upon his horse and galloped at full speed for the lane, which, being crowded with men and mules, did not afford him as prompt an exit as he wished. However, knocking down one and riding over another, he overcame the obstacles, shouting at the top of his voice, "The enemy are coming! The enemy are coming!" The excitement of the general-in-chief had such a terrifying effect on the men that every face turned pale. Order could no longer be preserved, and every man thought of flight or finding a hiding place and gave up all idea of fighting. Upon reaching the prairie, a column of attack was formed with trepidation and confusion, amid incoherent movement and contradictory orders. At this moment, His Excellency did me the honor to place me in command of the artillery and ordnance, giving me his orders verbally, with strict injunctions as to my responsibility. And that's the end of the quote by Delgado. Thomas J. Rusk, again, who was Secretary of War and serving in the Army at that time, described the events that occurred in his report that he wrote to President Burnett. He wrote, "Our army, under the command of General Houston, arrived here on the 20th. The enemy, a few miles off at New Washington, apprised of our arrival, committed some depredations upon private property and commenced their line of march to this point. They were unconscious of our approach until our standard was planted on the banks of the San Jacinto. Our position was a favorable one for battle. On the noon of the 20th, the appearance of the foe was hailed by our soldiers with enthusiasm." So here you have the setting. Houston and his men were spread out in the trees when Santa Anna and his soldiers arrived at about 11:30 to noon. and the soldiers commanded by Santa Anna consisted of veteran companies from Guadalajara, Toluca, Aldama, Guerrero, and Matamoros, as well as inexperienced peasant conscripts pressed into service by the army as it journeyed through their regions on the way to Texas. Most were equipped with the Brown Bess, the standard .75 caliber English flintlock musket that had a shorter range than most of the Texians' rifles. It shot about 50 yards somewhat accurately, is my understanding. More importantly, though, they were equipped with bayonets, which was essential for close combat. The infantry were also armed with sabers. The cavalry also had sabers as well as pistols. They wore dress uniforms of red and blue with white leather accoutrements and white and gold trim, along with being supplied with white cotton fatigue uniforms. Approaching Mexican scouts saw the Texian pickets from the plain of San Jacinto, and the mounted scouts rushed away to a southward grove of trees while the Texians attempted to conceal themselves. About 1 o'clock, Sidney Sherman returned from a reconnaissance to inform Houston that the Mexican cavalry was about a mile away. The Mexican dragoons came into sight, and Houston instructed his men to lay on the ground to conceal their numbers. According to one source, as the Mexican dragoons closed in, Houston declared in a loud voice, "Clear the guns and fire." Now, the cannons did not fire. They were not yet sighted properly, but Houston's cry, according to this source, halted the dragoons' approach, and they returned to the main body of the Mexican army. Then sharpshooters from the veteran Toluca company maneuvered to a grove of trees within gunshot range of the Texian camp, and the Mexican army positioned El Volcan, the one cannon that they had brought with them, and they set it up in a timbered spot, and they began to fire grape shot at the rebels and pirates who were obscured in the wooded encampment. It did no damage to the Texians since its aim was also too elevated. This time, the Texian artillery did respond. Artillery fire continued sporadically into the afternoon while Santa Anna and his army set up camp on the high ground above the marshes of the San Jacinto. The exchange of artillery fire did little actual damage to either army. Apparently, one Mexican soldier and one Texian soldier suffered injuries. Unfortunately, the Texian was the commander of the artillery, Colonel J.C. Neal. Hockley would be tapped to take over for the wounded former commander of the Alamo. Now, this was the moment the Texians had been waiting for, was it not? The moment to unleash their pent-up desire for vengeance? It was time for Houston to cry havoc and let slip the Texian dogs of war. The Mexican skirmishers had begun to withdraw along with their cannon. The cannon moved slowly, and some thought that they should go after it. But it wasn't the moment for General Houston. Now, Kentuckian Colonel Sidney Sherman was ready to take action and argued that he should be allowed to. And so, as an act of compromise, Houston finally agreed that he could take some mounted men out on a reconnaissance, but under no circumstances were Sherman and the 61 mounted riflemen to engage. But things went wrong, as they often do, and when the reconnaissance party went out beyond Houston's view, he and the army heard firing. Houston conveyed what happened when the Mexican army arrived in the following dispatch to President Burnett, and this was written on the 20th from Camp Safety, San Jacinto, Lynch's Crossing. Mr. President, dear sir, this morning the Army reached this point and was attacked at 11:30 a.m. by the Army of Santa Anna, which continued until 3 o'clock, when he withdrew his forces from the field. Our men were few who engaged the enemy, the balance remaining concealed for the purpose of hiding our number. His force is reported at 800. Ours does not exceed 750. I am disposed to think that the enemy intend another attack tonight by a change of position. We had but one man wounded. The enemy's loss is estimated from 18 to 20. There would be no difficulty in securing the rights of the people and the liberties of Texas if men would march to their duty and not fly like recreants from danger. Texas must be defended and liberty maintained. Sam Houston, Commander-in-Chief. P.S. Santa Anna was in the field. The officers and soldiers acted well. Colonel Rusk was in the action and fully met my wishes. Now, there are quite a few details that Houston left out of the message to President Burnett. Instead of just doing a reconnaissance, once they got beyond line of sight, Sherman ordered a charge. And after their initial assault, Sherman and his men dismounted to reload, as was the need to do with that kind of weapon. Then came the Mexican cavalry, armed with sabers and lances, followed by about 100 infantrymen. El Volcan launched grape shot at the Texians, and Mexican bugle played no quarter. Sherman called for reserves to come to his aid, but Houston would not allow any more of his men to put themselves into harm's way. He was not ready to fight yet. So Sherman and his men would have to fight back through to the Texian line. In the process, 3 men were wounded, and they lost several horses. Alwyn J. Trask, Devereaux J. Woodleaf, and Walter P. Lane were injured in the skirmish. And Trask died almost a month later from his injuries. Sherman never forgave Houston for not sending assistance, and he resented Houston's treatment of him upon his party's return to the trees. Now, Tennessee-born Captain Jesse Billingsley did not obey Houston's command to remain in the wooded area and chose to lead his men to Sherman's aid. He later remembered, quote, seeing, meaning Sherman's horsemen, under a heavy fire and receiving no orders from General Houston to go to their support, I determined to go voluntarily and accordingly led out the 1st Company of the 1st Regiment. Soon the entire regiment under Colonel Burleson followed. On the way to assist, they had to pass by General Houston, who ordered them to countermarch, to go back, do not engage. Billingsley recalled, quote, this order the men treated with derision, requesting him to countermarch himself, if he desired it, and steadily held on their way to the support of Colonel Sherman, and succeeded in driving the enemy behind their breastworks. But there was one more act of daring that occurred. Mirabeau Lamar, a Georgia native, who in the future would also be a thorn in Houston's side, had joined up with the Texans only a little while before, but he had come ready to fight. He had also come to seize his part of the promised opportunity that Texas represented for so many people that had come to Texas, and he began to seize it by distinguishing himself in this brief skirmish. He rescued 2 wounded men, killed a Mexican soldier in close combat, and assisted Secretary of War Thomas Rusk, who had found himself in a tight spot. Rusk found himself surrounded by lancers, and when at the point of death or capture, Lamar rode into the melee on his stallion and rescued the Secretary of War. While Sherman's men sought to return to their own lines, 19-year-old Irish-born Walter Lane was dismounted by a lance in the shoulder. As he attempted to make his way on foot, the lancers gave chase and closed in. Lamar blocked their advance and shot one with his pistol. Henry Carnes rode to Lane's rescue, and the 3 rode to the safety of their brothers in arms. The Mexican dragoons actually applauded Lamar for his bravery and his horsemanship, and he is said to have returned their acknowledgement with a bow and returned to his fellow Texas soldiers as well. For his actions, Lamar was promoted from private to colonel and given a command over the cavalry. Walter Lane, who was in the battle and was one of the ones wounded, offered his memory of the event at a later time. It's important to bear in mind that a lot of the recollections were written down at quite a bit of time after the actual event, so there might be some discrepancies. And there are often discrepancies, especially when you have a large number of people involved from different perspectives. But Lane remembered that that evening, meaning the 20th of April, 1836, Colonel Sherman went out to field the enemy with some 200 cavalry. We got in half a mile of their line when their cavalry came out to interview us. They got within 200 yards, halted, and formed. The officers rode out in front, waved their swords, and cried, Americanas, vene usted, come here. We did. The word was passed. All are ready for a charge. All ready. Charge, rang out, and we went through them like a stroke of lightning, chased them back to their infantry, and then fell back out of their fire. They reinforced and followed us out, challenged us again. We charged, routed, and drove them back on their infantry the second time. My horse, a powerful animal, had got excited, and having more zeal than discretion, took the bit in his teeth and ran me headlong into the midst of the enemy, much to my disgust. The order was given to retreat. I was unanimously in favor of it, but my horse wanted to go through. A Mexican officer settled the difficulty by cutting at my head with his saber. I threw up my gun and warded off the blow. My gun was empty. I drew a holster pistol, aimed at his head, and pulled trigger. It missed fire. He tucked his head down to avoid the shot when I hit him over the head with the pistol, knocking him senseless. Just then, a big Mexican lancer charged me in the side, running me through the shoulder with his lance, observing, "Carajo Americana, damn the Americans," and knocked me 10 feet off my horse. I fell on my head, stunned and senseless. General Amar rode up to succor me, shot the Mexican, and, thinking I was dead, fell back with the command. My comrades had got some 40 yards retreating when I regained consciousness and my feet at the same time. 20 Mexicans were around me when I rose, but it so surprised them to see a dead boy rise to his feet and run like a buck that I got 10 steps before they fired at me. Captain Carnes saw me coming and ordered his company to wheel and fire on my pursuers, which they did, killing a few when the balance halted. An old man told me, "Son, get up behind. I reckon the old Mar can take us both out." I did. She was a sorrel mare and thin in flesh. I would know her hide if it were dried on a fence even now, and she had the sharpest backbone it has ever been my fortune to straddle. General Houston, thinking we were bringing on a general engagement, sent out his infantry to support us. We got behind them, but as the enemy retired, both parties went back to camp. Dr. Good, our orderly sergeant, dressed my wound. It was not dangerous but painful. The lance had gone nearly through my shoulder blade. Lane would fight the next day in the battle, and as you see, he was under the recollection that Houston had ordered out some help, whereas other sources say that Houston did not allow people to go out, but Billingsley just went out on his own will. Another participant in the April 20th engagement, Oliver T. Brown, wrote, "We traveled 1,000 miles on foot in Texas before we got in gunshot of the enemy. But then we gave them hell on the 20th of April. The great General Santa Anna, at the head of 600 choice Mexican troops and a number of his bravest generals, I shall state to you that we elected Captain Sherman, colonel of the 2nd Regiment. He selected 70 horsemen out of the different regiments to make the attack. I, being 3rd Sergeant in our company, I was selected as one of the horsemen. On the 20th at 4 o'clock, we attacked the enemy. We killed about 20 and only had 2 men wounded on the first day. Then we retreated to our camp, waited for them to make an attack until 4 o'clock on the 21st. George Erath, who I mentioned earlier, was born and educated in Austria, recalled the moment with eloquent detail. He wrote, "Apprehensions were expressed that General Houston did not intend to fight there and might retreat further. To such a course, general resistance was announced. By his long retreat, Houston had made himself extremely unpopular, especially with the Western men, who in consequence of it had had their property destroyed, houses burned, and land devastated. But about 3 o'clock, the cavalry was thrown forward for a reconnaissance. Our regiment with 1 cannon followed a short distance to cover the reaction and took position in a small grove at the head of a shallow ravine on a plain incline toward the Mexican camp and in full view of it. Our cavalry came into action, moving from right to left, then turned and passed back on our left, carrying with them one of our men severely wounded. The Mexicans made a deploy as if to advance on us, but after the firing of several cannon on each side without any effect on us, retreated to their position. We too returned to camp. This maneuver disclosed the Mexican strength as considerably inferior to ours, and their position as badly chosen for their defense. The cry for attacking then became more unanimous, with the determination to retreat no further, and it was only by the advice and example of a sprinkle of old men among us, some of whom had been in the Revolutionary War and that of 1812, that we kept order and discipline to await the developments of next day. The night passed off comparatively quiet, with occasional cannon shots on either side, the enemies going far over us, as perhaps ours did over them, for their position was now in a bayou slightly protected by a low rise of the ground 300 yards in front. Rusk also gave additional details in his report. He wrote, "The enemy marched in good order, took a position in front of our encampment on an eminence within cannon shot, where they planted their only piece of artillery, a brass 9-pounder, and then arranged their cavalry and infantry a short distance on the right under the shelter of a skirt of woods. In a short time they commenced firing upon us, their cannon in front, their infantry on our left, and their cavalry changing the position on the right. A charge was made on the left of our camp by this infantry, which was promptly repelled by a few shots of our artillery, which forced them to retire. We have the satisfaction of stating that only 2 of our men were wounded, one very slightly, and the other, Colonel Neal of the artillery, not fatally. The attack ceased, the enemy retired, and formed in 2 pieces skirt of timber, and remained in that position, occasionally opening their cannon up on us until just before sunset, when they attempted to draw off their forces. The artillery and cavalry were removed to other points. Colonel Sherman, with 60 of our cavalry, charged upon theirs, consisting of upwards of 100, killing and wounding several. Their infantry came to the assistance of their cavalry and opened upon us an incessant firing for 10 or 15 minutes, which our men sustained with unprecedented firmness. Too much praise cannot be bestowed upon those who were engaged in this charge, for never was one of equal peril made. With more courage and determined with less loss, 2 of our men were severely wounded but none killed. This terminated the movements of the day." And Houston also provided more detail in his official report of the engagement. He wrote, "I have the honor to inform you that on the evening of the 18th instant, after a forced march of 55 miles, which was effected in 2 days and a half, the army arrived opposite Harrisburg. That evening a courier of the enemy was taken, from whom I learned that General Santa Anna, with 1 division of his choice troops, had marched in the direction of Lynch's Ferry on the San Jacinto, burning Harrisburg as it passed down. The army was ordered to be in readiness to march early on the next morning. The main body effected a crossing over Buffalo Bayou below Harrisburg on the morning of the 19th, having left the baggage, the sick, and a sufficient camp guard in the rear. We continued the march throughout the night, making but 1 halt in the prairie for a short time and without refreshment. At daylight, we resumed the line of march, and in a short distance our scouts encountered those of the enemy, and we received information that General Santa Anna was at New Washington and would that day take up his line of march for Anahuac, crossing at Lynch's. The Texian army halted within half a mile of the ferry and some timber, and were engaged in slaughtering beeves, when the army of General Santa Anna was discovered to be approaching in battle array, having been encamped at Clopper's Point 8 miles below. Disposition was immediately made of our forces in preparation for his reception. He took a position with his infantry and artillery in the center, occupying an island of timber, his cavalry covering the left flank. Their artillery then opened upon our encampment, consisting of 1 double-fortified medium brass 12-pounders. The infantry in columns advanced with the design of charging our lines, but were repulsed by a discharge of grape and canister from our artillery, consisting of 1 double-fortified 2 6-pounders. The enemy had occupied a piece of timber within rifle shot of the left wing of our army, from which an occasional interchange of small arms took place between the troops, until the enemy withdrew to a position on the bank of the San Jacinto, about 3/4 of a mile from our encampment, and commenced a fortification. A short time before sunset, our mounted men, about 85 in number, under the special command of Colonel Sherman, marched out for the purpose of reconnoitering the enemy. Whilst advancing, they received a volley from the left of the enemy's infantry, and after a sharp reconnoiter with their cavalry, in which ours acted extremely well and performed some feats of daring chivalry, they retired in good order, having had 2 men severely wounded and several horses killed. In the meantime, the infantry under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Millard and Colonel Burleson's regiment with artillery had marched out for the purpose of covering the retreat of the cavalry, if necessary. All then fell back in good order to our encampment about sunset and remained without any ostensible action until the 21st at 3:30, taking the first refreshment which they had enjoyed for 2 days. The enemy, in the meantime, having extended the right flank of their infantry so as to occupy the extreme points of a skirt of timber on the bank of the San Jacinto, and secured their left by a fortification about 5 feet high, constructed of packs and baggage, leaving an opening in the center of the breastwork in which their artillery was placed, their cavalry upon their left wing. And to be extremely thorough, we should also consider Colonel Delgado's account that gives us a different perspective of the same events from the Mexican side. He wrote, "Meanwhile, the officers having dismounted and taken their stations in front of their commands, we moved in search of the enemy, with flankers on both sides to explore the woods. As the knapsacks might impede the movements of the men, His Excellency ordered that they should be dropped on the road, still preserving our formation. The order was obeyed, the knapsacks being left in the keeping of Providence or fortune, and we resumed our march. It was 2:00 p.m. when we descried Houston's pickets at the edge of a large wood in which he concealed his main force. Our skirmishers commenced firing, when they were answered by the enemy, who fell back into the wood. His Excellency reached the ground with the main body with the intention, as I understood, of attacking at once, but they kept hidden, which kept him from ascertaining their position. He therefore changed his dispositions and ordered the company of Toluca to deploy as skirmishers in the direction of the woods. Our cannon, established on a small elevation, opened its fire. The enemy responded with a discharge of grape, which wounded severely Captain Ureza and killed his horse. At this moment His Excellency came to me and ordered me to unload the ordnance stores and to turn over the 20 mules on which they were packed to Captain Barragon, who was instructed to bring in the knapsacks that had been left on the road. I was cautious enough to part with only 18 mules, keeping 2 for an emergency. Then His Excellency went to look for a camping ground and established his whole force along the shore of San Jacinto Bay, at least 1 mile from the place where I had been left. About 1 hour later, I received orders through Colonel Bringas to come into camp immediately with the ordnance stores and the piece of artillery. That officer was also the bearer of an order to the company of Toluca, the only force that checked the enemy, to fall back likewise. I observed to Colonel Bringas that would take some time to execute this order, the chests, as His Excellency knew, being piled up on the ground, and I only having 2 mules upon to load them, and that, furthermore, if the company of Toluca left me unsupported, the enemy would probably pounce upon the stores, all of which would go to the devil. Colonel Bringas advised me to do best I could, adding that I ought to know that no observations could be made to His Excellency, and he had no desire to argue with him in the raving state of mind in which he was. The colonel parted from me, followed by the company of Toluca. It may well be imagined that when the enemy saw our artillery and stores unprotected, he paid them special attention. He established his cannon in such a manner as to disable our gun and to support an attack should it take place. Their first shot shattered the caisson on the limber, and another scattered about our ordnance boxes. Another again killed 2 fine mules, and they kept annoying us during the 2 long hours it took me to remove, with only 2 mules, 40 and odd boxes of ammunition. How the general-in-chief had endangered the whole division. I acknowledge that I had never been within such danger. What would have become of me in consequence of the general's order the enemy had captured our artillery and ordnance stores, as he might have done, unsupported as it was? I had no resource left but to make the best defense I could with my gun. For this purpose, I instructed Lieutenant Arenal to have it loaded with grape and not to fire until the enemy came in close range, in order both to spare ammunition and to intimidate the assailants. At length, at 5:00 p.m., my duty was performed, and as I entered the camp with the last load, I was closely followed by the enemy's cavalry. His Excellency, noticing it, instructed me to order Captain Aguirre, who commanded our cavalry, to face the enemy without gaining ground. This movement checked the enemy for a few moments, but soon after they dashed upon our dragoons and were close enough to engage them with the sword, without, however, any material result. Then, His Excellency, deploying several companies as skirmishers, forced the enemy back to his camp, on which he retired sluggishly and in disorder. This engagement took place after sundown. Now, Creed Taylor, who had gone AWOL to attend to his family in the runaway scrape, heard these events from afar as he rushed to join the army, or I should say rejoin. The following in his record, he wrote, "Securing fresh horses, which were had for the asking, we set out to overtake the Texan army. En route, we fell in with Captain Tomlinson and a few other settlers, and we all pushed forward with much haste. When we reached the smoking debris of Harrisburg, which had just been burned by the Mexicans, we learned the whereabouts of Houston's forces and the close proximity of the Mexican army to the Texan camp. Our horses were becoming greatly jaded, but we could not brook the thought of being too late for a fight with an expletive about the Mexicans soldiers. So we pushed on with all possible speed. In the afternoon of April 20th, when within a few miles of the seat of war, we heard heavy artillery fire and were quite sure the fight was on. It chagrined us deeply to think that we were not in the fracas. Spurring forward in a gallop, we reached the Texan camp near sundown and were overjoyed to meet our comrades and to learn that we still had prospects of engaging the enemy in a real battle at any moment. General Sherman's men had just come out of a skirmish with the Mexican cavalry and were entertaining groups of eager listeners with accounts of what they had seen and done while out reconnoitering. The general opinion was that a real fight was brewing, inevitable." That was the end of combat on April 20th, and the two armies established their camps. The enemies were about a mile apart, a plain of tall grass stretching between them. The Mexican army camped with the marsh and Peggy's Lake to their rear. The open prairie stretched out before them. General Houston posted sentries for the night and ordered the rest of the Texian army to get as much rest and nourishment as they could. He himself had not had a good night's sleep in weeks, and no one knew what was going to happen the next day.
You are listening to Texas History Lessons, a slow walk through Texas history made in Texas by a Texan for everyone, everywhere.
That's a good spot to stop for those that prefer to listen to it at shorter episodes. This is already, the first and second part together are already over an hour, well over an hour. So we'll close this part 2 of the Battle of San Jacinto out. I want to thank you for listening. If you're listening on YouTube, please subscribe and like. And if you're listening just as a normal podcast, please subscribe and share the podcast with friends. I want to thank Derek McClendon for the theme music. Thanks again. We'll see you soon with more Texas history content. And take care of yourself. Take care of one another. Be kind. Adios.